אני רואה שאנשים עוד ממשיכים להיכנס, אז נחכה עוד דקה, ואז נתחיל. שנתחיל? Okay. As good evening, we are starting for all the English speakers. We'd like to welcome everybody and say we are very happy to see you, all of you, and thank you for finding the time to join us and meet us here to discuss a topic that we think it's very important. I'm Dr. Chava Ehrlich, Head of Planning and Urbanism Team in the Jerusalem Institute for Policy Research in Jerusalem. I'm an architect and a planner and lead together with my colleagues in the Institute researches and policy papers. I would like to first of all to thank the people I work with here, Erele Ganan, Malicha Zugayer, and Noam Shani, that helped us to plan and make this lab happen. And we send our thanks to Anna Cohen-Kohler, and we welcome Julius Freitag von Loringhoven from the Naumann Foundation, which supported and enabled this international lab. We are very happy to have Mr. von Loringhoven here, but he had some technological problems. So I invite you to look in the chat. He wrote some greetings and the perspective of Naumann Foundation on this event. Thank you very much for your kind words, Julius. And I would also like to thank our speaker guests and that arrived from different parts of the world. And we very much appreciate their willingness to share their knowledge with us. I would like to invite Dr. David Koren, the CEO of the Institute, to welcome us with some short greetings. David?
Thank you very much, Chava. Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to open this very important discussion. First of all, I would like to thank our partners from the Naumann Foundation. It's a pleasure for us to work with you about all the important topics of Jerusalem as a whole, and specifically East Jerusalem. I would like to thank Dr. Chava Ehrlich, the head of the Planning and Urbanic Studies team in our institute, and Noam, Erela, and Malicha for all the good work about this very important event. Our institute was established in 1978, approximately 44 years ago, by the late mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek, who understood widely that the city of Jerusalem has to have an independent research institute. And our institute is completely independent, and we are mainly targeting at deepening the understanding about what are the trends in Jerusalem as a whole, and specifically in East Jerusalem. The issue of zoning and planning in East Jerusalem is one of the major topics. And previously I worked as the advisor of the mayor of Jerusalem for East Jerusalem affairs. And the issue of zoning and planning was the main issue that concerned both the municipality, both the government, and the residents of East Jerusalem themselves. So I think that our unique discussion today will open us a new vision for understanding the challenges of informal buildings and informal architect in Jerusalem as a case study for other areas of the world. And I think we all will be very pleased to hear all our speakers, both from Israel and both abroad. I appreciate very much the time that you are spending with us and wishes us a very good discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So informal housing is a common phenomenon around the world, with a higher intensity and performance in developing countries. It is estimated that about 30% of the world population is living in informal housing, mostly in dwellings sprawling horizontally. As the population that seeks affordable housing in informal areas is growing, the situation is leading to the emergence of a new specific type of informal housing, a vertical one. We call it the vertical informality, which is a term that our researcher, Maliha Zugair, coined, and she will expand about this later. But this is not a place-unique phenomena. We would hear more about that from our speakers that studied this phenomena in different parts of the world. So we aim to look at informal housing from a worldwide perspective and learn about the processes and implication of its emergence in different contexts. We wish to develop our own abilities to designate policies that shall enhance the quality of the daily life of the dwellers of these areas. In Israel, it's especially we focus on East Jerusalem, and we wish to develop tools to upgrade the living conditions under the circumstances of vertical informality. So the schedule for today would be 3 15-minute talks, comments, and open discussion. I'm sorry to let you know that our speaker from Portugal, Dr. Ines Calor, is sick. Is too sick to talk, and I think she's in the participants here, and we wish her that she will get well soon. So we have 15 minutes talks from Professor Rachel Alterman from the Faculty of Architecture and Town Planning from the Technion in Israel, and the senior researcher at the Naaman Institute. Professor Alterman would frame the subject for us, and she would talk about between the informal and illegal. Then Ms. Namrata Kapoor, senior consultant in academics and research from the Indian Institute of Human Settlements, would talk about contagious neighbors, the case of tuberculosis in slum redevelopment in buildings in Mumbai. And last but not least, our Maliha Zugair, she's a researcher in Jerusalem Institute of Policy for Policy Research. She would talk about her research on vertical informality, the case of Kafar Akab in East Jerusalem. And Professor Alan Smart, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology and Archaeology from the University of Calgary, who recently published a book about formalizing squatting Hong Kong, would share some response and comments with us. And we sending special thanks for Professor Alan Smart, because it was a very last minute call, and he was very nice to accept our invitation to participate. So this is a few pictures from about that show Kafar Akab, the vertical informality in Kafar Akab. And I would share and invite Rachel to share her presentation, and with no further delay, we'll start.
Hi, everybody. Let me put my PowerPoint on. Hi, Alan, meantime.
Hello, Rachel.
Hi. I'm not watching you.
Sorry, I missed.
Sorry. Okay, now I can see. And here we are. Ines, my colleague in Chile, and that's also where we met Alan Smart. She's not well, but she's here. And I think I'll present one or two examples from Portugal just to give a sense of what she may have. Where is she? May have presented. Okay, let me do the, okay. So,
רחל, אנחנו רואים, אנחנו לא הפסקנו לראות את
oh no, you're seeing something else. Yes, I'm sorry. Why doesn't the Jerusalem case start? That's another presentation. For some reason, it hopped up. Let me try once more. Informality going vertical. I, in fact, have two versions. Can you see now? Can you see now?
לא, את צריכה לעשות הפסק ואולי...
Yeah, okay, just checking.
Hava, do you want me to start meanwhile?
I think that Professor Alterman's presentation is framing the subject in a more general way, so we'll wait another minute.
Okay.
I'm back. Their screen. I'm sorry. It's okay. Informality. Cool. Informal and on. There. Yes or no?
Just one more second, I think, until we see it.
Okay, can you see or not?
No, you
כן,
just need to
אנחנו
full.
רואים, אבל זה לא בפול סקרין. מעולה. יאללה, מתחילים.
Okay, everybody.
Yes.
So, I'd like to share with you thoughts developed over several years now. And there's a paper by this name. The paper has many more dilemmas and examples. So you're welcome to download it. Just put my name. Very good. Put Ines Calor. So Alterman and Calor will get you this one. We also have another paper called When Enforcement Fails. But that one is less relevant for the current situation now. However, again, if you put Alterman and Calor, we have different name orders in the two. You have some of the, there are Alan is one of them, but actually he's talking about Hong Kong. So these could be very relevant because East Jerusalem is midway. So first of all, my first unpopular statement, but I think I'll become a bit more popular later on, is informal is not the same as illegal. And the word informal cannot and should not substitute for illegal in all situations. In fact, informal and illegal could be viewed in a Venn diagram, but this Venn diagram should move depending on legal, socioeconomic, and other aspects of context. So I would say that never, maybe except in a country with totally no governance and no planning law at all, which is very few countries, never will informal and illegal be the same thing. And I do not support the current fashion, which has come to the global north. In the global south, a lot of development. Actually, in many countries, the vast majority of development could be called informal. But in the global north, very little development should be called informal. And the rest should be called illegal. If we could fuse it to, we should take it to other areas of law. For example, would you say, well, I just prefer not to pay my taxes. I'll call the taxation informal and then I'm okay. Isn't that great? I prefer to drive the wrong way in the street because I'm driving informally. So there's a big danger in undermining the total rule of law by calling everything or anything you want to informal, anything that suits you at the moment informal. I'll get to many examples, and these examples will show that in the paper between informal and illegal, I'll be more popular when you read it. I won't go into the details now because there I try to draw 8 types of cases where situations, and these are not places, but situations, legal, socioeconomic, governance, time, where in the global north, illegal merits to be called informal. Actually, in all those situations, or in most of them actually, the guilty party in those 8 situations are not the consumers, are not the people who use the land, residents or commercial or industrial or quasi almost public services. They're not the guilty ones in those 8 very special situations. The guilty parties is bad planning. And there's lots of bad planning. Not bad in the sense that, no, I don't like it. It's not a good neighborhood. It's far to walk. It's, I don't know, it doesn't have enough social integration. It's bad planning because it just does not fit human behavior, human needs, social justice, legal justice. And that's those few cases, it's planning that's wrong, and enforcement, if it occurs, should not be. So, point here, there is an overlap. In each country, there is some overlap. And I'll show examples in a minute, but this overlap would move. It could move between global south and global north, or global south would have a very, very big circle and a very tiny situations where illegality should be used. And the global north, it should move to the right, and it depends on the country and on the situation. So now let's kind of is about the global south. And this is where the word informal came from. And it's a very good word. There are some substitutes, irregular, self-help. Ines and I at some point actually did we tried to do a survey of the usage of words. It's very difficult to do because we don't know whether the writer is writing from where and which where and what about. But the word informal, it's a winner about the global discussions of the global south, especially housing, but not only. And in the global south, as I said, non-compliant development is the rule, not the exception. Developing countries usually have poorly functioning governance system, and where governance does not work well, when the procedures are corrupt, when the procedures are not clear, when court decisions can take a generation, if at all, where there's a huge amount of corruption, and sometimes where government doesn't even work at all, then you can't even say illegal in a just way, because there the use of illegal would probably often be used selectively. We want to put you in jail, we can always find an infringement of some planning law if it works at all. But look at the red point. In the global south, the important discussion, the main discussion is not about land use planning, also called in US and Canada only zoning, etc. It's not about planning law, it's about property rights. And the major discussion of squatting and the various configurations of I live here, you live there, in self-help or half self-help, the discussion is about property. It could be landlord in government or in the local mafia. And it could be about me and my neighbor, both built who share informal housing or close by, and we struggle and we have a conflict about where the boundaries lie. Most of the land in the world is not yet registered. So registration process itself could entail conflict. There are some estimates that it will take 100 years to register our land, but I don't know, because now we have hovering and we have remote sensing, so perhaps, but there's no registration also because governments don't want it, populations don't want it, and there's no financing, etc. Now, East Jerusalem is in the twilight zone, like before sunset or before the sun rises, dawn or twilight, because it is, after an annexation, it is within a good governance country. There are scales of governance. Israel is definitely not the worst in the OECD. There are worse ones. There are many better ones, but we do have a functioning governance system. Does it work? And a generally functioning planning law system. Does it work in East Jerusalem? Probably not very well. Probably selectively, but probably partially. Note, please, that in East Jerusalem, I assume I'm not an expert. Canada is registered. So
Rachel, your internet line is not so well. I'm sorry.
so
Maybe you'll turn off your camera so we just can hear you, or your
my camera.
Yeah. Because
Turn on my.
Rochelle, I think she means mute your video.
Yeah,
Stop
mute
the
your
video.
so we just can hear you. And
I don't.
At the bottom left of your screen, it should say mute or stop video.
My dear. Okay.
Yes, now we hear you. You can mute your camera so you have more. Oh, but
What do you mean?
You got out of your presentation.
No, I'm not.
Yes, you turned off your presentation.
Sorry, I'm not going to continue. Okay, this is the Technion, and if it doesn't work well, I don't know, then Israeli technology is not very good, and we should quit the startup nation. No, I don't think it's a good idea to speak without.
Okay. Okay, but you went out of your presentation.
I did for a minute. Well, you want me to go on like
yes,
this?
You still have 5 minutes, so can you please go on? Would appreciate that.
So I want to challenge you and say that I want to challenge you and for you to tell me what's informal and what's illegal in the following example. Let me see where I am. I'm going
Can you
to
please share the screen again?
Hava, I've lost so much time in.
Okay.
So either you give me more time or we quit now. Simply because
yes, we have more time, but you don't share your screen.
I will share my screen.
Okay, share your screen and we'll give you more time. How much time do you need?
Well, stop me when your time is ready.
Okay.
So non-compliance to some degree, oh, let me put the this is universal. And I've found a few tiny examples, even in Denmark, which would rank very, very, very high in governance. There's no scale of planning governance, but there is of governance. A few people take a bit of shortcuts along the beach, a little tiny bit, very tiny bit. Quite bigger infringements in Austria. When do people like to kind of disobey the law a bit? In their summer homes on the Alps? Some of that. In fact, the further from the urban centers, there's sometimes a bit more relaxation. But it's very difficult to demarcate in the global north. It's easy in the global south. You see the need, you see the disasters, you see the economy. Without the informal economy, let's see, where is that picture? Oh, well, you know what the global, it's in the other presentation, what the global south looks like. Without those squatters, there'd be no economy. As weak as the economy is in Africa and in parts of South America and parts of Asia. So squatting is necessary. Well, is this informal? Some of Israel. It is. Should you call it? If you ask most people, they'll tell you just a little bit. I mean, we didn't really know, and we actually needed it. We have another child, and there's not much room in the apartment, and we needed it. Is this illegal or informal? This is an example from Greece. In Greece, there's a lot of illegality. They don't call it informality, by the way, because it's massive and it doesn't correlate. Maybe in some parts of Athens where there's refugees today, or in some of the islands with taken in refugees. But in general, they call it illegal. They know it's illegal. And there's a lot along the coast, entire permanent settlements, many summer homes, and in the urban areas. Now, the reason I show this is during the economic crisis, 2008, 9, 10, Greece, which was already a bit of a toppling economy, suffered a lot. And then the international group that monitored their financing, the International Monetary Fund, probably the EU and something else, some big brothers, they said, make money on the illegalities. And they started imposing huge fines in the cities. And these are very popular illegalities. These are closed balconies. They make a difference between ones that are in the building within the line and ones that are outside the line, and lots of fines paid. And this is what the country started, the big money. This is Israel, which tried to combat the closing balconies by forcing architecture as an enforcement agent. These are jumping balconies. Some of these are Israel, some of them may be my neighbors. Some of these are not. Please note the bottom. Can you see what the problem there is? This garage is already housing or business. Do you see what the problem is at the bottom? It's a nice villa. Hint, look at the slope.
Yes, it is to be a...
There's no slope. It's supposed to be garage, which is extra beyond the development rights. It's free development rights. and so much cheaper in many respects. And instead of being able to drive down, this has been leveled out, so it's part of the house or an accessory dwelling unit or something like that. Well, I'm mixing up the examples. This is an example from the southern part of Portugal, which is almost the Mediterranean, Faro area, and there's an island there, which is an island for environmental preservation because it flats to very major seas, and it has very special sort of Mediterranean and Atlantic, and a very special flora and fauna. Well, the mixture here, it used to be fishermen, and there are a few fishermen somewhere, hard to know, but there are lots of totally illegal homes, and these homes belong to Portuguese, including Faro people, including professors, and including local government people. When we tried to interview, it was impossible because they had villas here. And in fact, there was threats against the enforcement agent with whom we spoke. He survived. Now, what we tell here is attempts to say that these should not be demolished. There are demolition orders because it is totally, there's nothing possible there. It's a total preservation, environmental preservation. They said that they discovered a kind of a bird, and this is the habitat of the bird, and the bird, no, it's not a bird, it's
chameleon.
Yeah. And it likes to live in the habitat, and they drew this through the courts, and it took years and years until the court finally said it's a big excuse. But they recruited the environmentalists, and I don't know what's demolished yet, but it's hard to enforce because it's now. Is this illegal or enforcement? Is this illegal or enforcement? It's one of the case studies that we have in our paper. Is this illegal or is this or this informal? What is it? Is this hotel illegal or informal? It's probably everybody would say illegal.
Rachel, can you please wrap it up?
Yes. This is another example in our paper. Romas, gypsies, Soanim, in Britain. This went to the EU Supreme Court, not to the EU, to the European Court of Justice. And, well, you could read the thing yourselves in the paper. And let me conclude some more of this. Now, you take this one on the left. Ultra-Orthodox areas in Israel are full of extensions, vertical extensions on the buildings. The new cities included, Elad and the other ones, the city, new building, a year old, 2 years old, they're not just, they have between 8 and 14 kids, they need it. No enforcement can actually manage this. So let me conclude. This is Britain. What are we going to do? In the paper, we developed very difficult. It was the toughest paper I've ever written intellectually. I threw out 10,000 words of writing, and we debated this back and forth, and finally tried to distill 8 situations in which we would say the law should look at itself and not enforce. One of the situations, only one was from Israel in that example, was Arab villages, towns in Israel with self-owned land, and a situation where the buildings are probably good and they're by the building codes, but they do not have a building permit because they jump over agricultural land. I said that the government should retreat from that, and I do not have a set opinion about East Jerusalem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you stop sharing and we will move? Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I hope it helped with framing the subject to people that are new to this subject. Thank you very much, Rachel. So we now move to Ms. Namarta Kapoor, Senior Consultant, Academic and Research, Indian Institute of Human Settlements. She would present herself and talk about contagious neighbors, the case of tuberculosis in slum redevelopment buildings in Mumbai. Namarta, you here?
Yeah, I'm here. Just a second.
Hi.
Let me share my screen. And yeah, all right. I think you guys can see it. Let me present it full screen. All right, I am going to speak to you about something a little bit different. I know we started off with informality, and thank you for that framing. I am going to actually speak to you about a case which kind of challenges this notion of whether it is informal or whether something is an exception, and how do you perceive an exception to a planning norm. Okay, so I'm not going to speak to you about buildings built by people themselves. I'm going to speak to you about a government-built rehabilitation colony. And I'm going to speak to you through the case of tuberculosis. So we'll go through the narrative and I'll then try and sum this up. Yeah. This is Dr. Ravikant, and he works in the M East ward in Mumbai, and he once showed us this image. So if you have a look at it, it's a satellite image of a housing colony in the M East ward of Mumbai. And then he showed us these numbers on the right-hand side and said, what do you think these numbers are? So let's just interpret this image one. These are bar buildings, like, one bar is one entire building. And, he said that these numbers on the side actually are the number of tuberculosis cases that are there in each of these buildings. And if you can see this, the number ranges from of 44, which is really, really high, 46, 51. In each of these buildings, these are the number of people who have tuberculosis. And this was a really shocking number, but he knew this case because he has a clinic right here in this building. He has a clinic right here. And his organization, the Doctors for You Foundation, which is sort of like the Doctors Without Borders, is fashioned around the same way, provides the direct observed treatment, the DOTS program in each of these colonies. And they saw that there was a rising number of people who were catching tuberculosis in these colonies. Now, we have all just emerged from a COVID nightmare, and there is a certain amount of relatability, as to what it means to have a contagious neighbor. And even if one person in your colony got COVID, everybody got such a fright, and there were so many quarantine measures that were taken. And these are people who are living day in and day out with about 51 people in their building having tuberculosis, and nothing, nobody blinked an eye all the way until the study was done. And so his organization does not do the DOTS program in just this particular colony, which I just showed you, the Natar Parekh compound. They do it in 3 colonies in that same area. Now, these are all 3 colonies are located sort of within a 1 kilometer distance from each other. Just in case I'm using the word colony and it's unfamiliar, a colony is a group of housing. So it's like a group housing for people. So all of these 3 group housing colonies are actually located within 1 kilometer of each other. Yeah. So the kind of the pollution or is very similar in this neighborhood. So he showed us all these 3 colonies, and he said that I observed something really strange. The first colony, which is the PMG Colony, has a burden of just 1% of tuberculosis cases. The second colony, that is the Lalubhai compound, had 8% burden of tuberculosis. And the third colony, Natwarpare compound, had about 10% burden of tuberculosis. And he said, I don't know why this is the case, because what is happening is that the people who are living in all of these three colonies belong to the same socioeconomic class. They belong to the similar kinds of, backgrounds. They do very similar kinds of work. In fact, they are what we call project affected people. And what is the project affected people? It's like if there is a slum in a particular area and a road has to be built through the slum. The road is the project. And the people who get displaced by that are the project affected people. And by law, those people have to be rehabilitated. And then they get rehabilitated in housing colonies of this sort. So this is basically all three are project affected people colonies. They're coming from very similar socioeconomic backgrounds. Why is it that one particular colony has a burden of only 1%, while the others have a burden of tuberculosis, which is up to 10%? There was so we also did some other studies where we found out that it's not just the high percentage of tuberculosis cases within a colony. In fact, if you look at this particular chart, what we find is that 80% of the TB patients got the disease after they were shifted into these colonies. So they did not have tuberculosis in the slums where they were before, but they got tuberculosis after they shifted into the colony. So if you read this graph, basically, this is the incidence of tuberculosis. And this is the year in which they moved in. So 0 is the year in which they move in. And then there is this kind of like a rising graph in the number of people who have tuberculosis once they shift into the colony. And so basically, he was like, why is this happening? And what they did is that basically they put together a team of architects, planners, and architects, planners, and doctors to go ahead and study this phenomena. So I was one of the planners on this team, and it is kind of obvious from the images that you see itself. Like for a lot of people, it's clear to the naked eye that the PMG Colony, if you look at this building, there is like sunlight pouring down all the way down to the bottom of the building. And the other two buildings are really too close to each other. And there is this overcrowding in these areas. And there's absolutely no sunlight which is coming down through. And of course, the problem is exacerbated when there are rains, right? And so lo and behold, we wanted to do this as a scientific study. So we did take in all our instruments and did all these, different kinds of daylight factors and SDFs and all of those kind of things, and concluded the exact same thing that you can see from the naked eye. Basically, that there is no light and ventilation in the lower floors of these buildings. And if you see the first colony where there is a burden of tuberculosis just 1%, there is good light and ventilation conditions. Now, why is it that the architecture of those two colonies is terrible and the architecture of the first colony is kind of good? Are they just bad architects? My answer is no. These architects have been mandated to build in this bad manner. Okay. But before we go ahead and I explain why am I saying that these architects have been mandated to build in this bad manner, let's try and understand what are the kinds of design mandates that architects have to follow. Okay. So there are two kinds of codes in India. There is the National Building Code, which is at the national level, and then there are development control regulations, which are at the city level. So these are city norms that are built upon, the National Building Code. The development control regulations for every city is the law, and this is a sort of a guideline from which this is built. And the development control regulations, or the DCRs, they tell you what should be the distance between two buildings, what should be the height of the building, how should be the window designed, how much should be the open space between two colonies, etc. Yeah. And the question is basically like, okay, you have these design mandates. Where does the rationale for these DCRs come from? And to explain that, I'll take a small deviation. Yeah. They actually, in the case of Bombay, they come from the plague of 1896. Now, this is Bombay in 1896. Okay. Bombay is right now sprawling all the way up till here. This is 2022 Bombay. This is 1896 Bombay, which is a really small part of the entire mega city right now. But basically what happened is that, you see, this was the area which was occupied by the British. There was an esplanade around the fort area, which is the British controlled area. There is the native town, which was located, away from the esplanade. And this is the port side of Bombay, yeah? And now what happened is that basically in 1896, the plague breaks out and labor starts leaving the city. The British government rightly gets, sort of like worried about the situation because there are, the mercantile economy is getting affected. So what do we do about it? It's not just that, it's also there are cases of plague which are coming into the White Town, and that also creates a certain kind of, worry that you cannot actually escape this problem and contain it only to the Black Town. So what happens is basically that they begin to take certain kinds of measures, where they are going through these streets and they are like flushing these streets and disinfecting the streets. And at that time, the idea is basically that a plague is rising from the miasmas in the ground, and so these are the kind of measures which are taken. And there are three important measures that get taken at that point in time. One is basically the decongestion of the native town. So what they do is basically they just ram through the native town and make these two large streets, boulevards, which in their minds is kind of cross-ventilating the city. Okay, so there is there are two sort of as you can see, Bombay is an island, and these streets are cross-ventilating the city in some ways. They also sort of like reclaim extra land towards the south so that the White Town can expand. And then there is another thing that they do is that they start so they start annexing land towards the north of the city. So basically, that becomes the suburbia for Bombay, which is going to be planned on the concept of the garden city. So for those of you who are aware, the garden city concept is basically sort of, trying to build suburbs which are healthier, which have proper light and ventilation. And if this is the inner city area, like, the garden city was supposed to be the escape from that industrial inner city town. And so you see these buildings coming up, which are built with a lot of distance between two buildings. So if you see over here, all these buildings are jammed in, crammed next to each other. There's a lot of distance between these two buildings, and that is where the garden city concept comes up. And this is where the development control regulations also start their journey. Yeah. And so what was mandated is that if you have two buildings, the distance between the two buildings has to be half of the height. That's what it started with. That was the h/2 rule. So if the height of the building is like 24 meters, then the distance from one side, has to be 12, and the other side has to be 12. And then they decided that it's too much, maybe h/3 is enough. And so then it became the height of the building from one side has to be 8 meters and the height from the other side has to be 8 meters. So you get at least 16 meters between two 24-meter high buildings. That is where you have the genesis of the development control regulations. Yeah, so you realize that the development control regulations are actually coming about in the wake of a contagion, and it is a means to build form which is healthy and that does not, where contagion doesn't spread easily. Now, so if you look at the PMG colony, it follows the h/3 rule. And that is why you see that there is light streaming down all the way till the bottom of the building. If you look at these two buildings, they don't follow the h/3 rule. Instead of a 16-meter distance between two buildings, the distance between buildings in these areas is hardly 3 meters. And the question is basically, why is it that these buildings do not have a good distance between them? And why is it that this one has a great distance between them? The answer is basically, this building is following what is called the general regulations. And these buildings are following what are called the slum redevelopment regulations. Okay. Now, don't get too confused. I'll explain this. What is a slum development regulation? What has it got to do for distance between buildings? Small deviation. Basically, imagine this is slum housing. What slum redevelopment does is basically, a slum housing in India is about, 2 stories maximum. Yeah, 1 or 2 stories maximum. what what the government does is that it comes in and says, we are going to rehabilitate you in these 8-story towers, and we will use the rest of the area for market housing. So we will just take the same amount of land, like jam people into rehabilitation housing and use as much land as possible that we can get for market housing. Now, this is called a slum rehabilitation scheme, and these cross-subsidize each other. The land comes for free in this. Now, what is happening over here is that if a government wants the sort of like the highest density on the least amount of land so that they can get as much land as possible for market housing, right? And how do you get that? You get that by decreasing the distance between buildings. You get that by increasing the height of buildings. You get that by getting rid of open spaces. And you get that by increasing unit density. So now when I come back to these examples, you realize that basically in these SRA norms or the slum rehabilitation norms, buildings are being jammed next to each other. And in this particular one, which is the general regulation that all other buildings in the city follow, which are not slum rehabilitation buildings, you get good light and ventilation conditions. So there's almost like there's a discriminatory sort of, the two different kinds of regulations that are available in the scenario over here. So if these buildings were to be made with that same distance norm, this is how far they would have to be apart. And you can see that, this makes a lot of difference to the light and ventilation conditions that come in. The other kinds of reasons are obviously that there is some amount of cross ventilation in this building, and these buildings don't have any cross ventilation. In fact, if you see this particular multipurpose room opens into a corridor, so this is great part of the corridor, and that creates that kind of, so you'll see this better over here. So here there's a corridor and the windows open this side, but in this one, what happens is the windows open to a corridor, and for the need of privacy, what people are doing is they're like sort of, they're pulling in the curtains, they are kind of like shutting the windows, which is not the case in this particular housing colony. You see, like these are arms, and then there are wings for housing in each of in this building, and there are light shafts in the center as well. So this design is definitely more conducive for better light and ventilation over here. And these are not very conducive. People are like, the ventilation conditions are terrible, and people are exacerbating it by shutting windows to maintain certain amount of privacy. What I want to point you to is that the density between these buildings is not too different. Like there are this one has about 914 units per hectare. These have about 1100 units per hectare. I mean, this is also very dense, like actually the National Building Code does not allow for more than 500 dwelling units per hectare in group housing for the poor. But here you see a very high density. So it's not density, it is design, which is a terrible problem over here. Okay, now is where I come to the concluding part, where I kind of will try and relate this to what the discussion can be going forward. And that is basically that, these relaxations to build slum redevelopment buildings, these relaxations of norms, putting buildings together, not following the H/3 rule, is actually in violation of the government's own sort of code. As per Section 63 on discretionary powers, so a discretionary power is that there is a norm and you can deviate from the norm and create an exception. It was stated that basically in specific cases where it's clearly demonstrable hardship is caused, the commissioner may, for reasons to be recorded in writing, by special permission, permit any of the dimensions prescribed by these regulations to be modified. So the law says basically that you can deviate from the norm, provided that the relaxation will not affect the health, safety, fire safety, structural safety, and public safety of the inhabitants of the buildings and the neighborhood. As we have demonstrated in the TB case, this is not being met. The public health of the people is being compromised. And so actually, the relaxations permitted under the Slum Rehabilitation Act are a violation of the government's own code. And here is where I want to sort of like, I want us to think about this idea of informality, where basically where informality is assumed to be something that people do as deviations. Here is a government deviating from its own norm. And how do you think about informality in this case? And how do you think about the kind of grave repercussions this kind of an exception is having on the whole? And that's where I'd like to leave my provocation.
Wow, thank you very much. It was very interesting, your analysis, and I enjoyed it. I hope the other. Thank you very much. I hope you'd stay with us to the discussion. And now we move to our own Maliha Zegaya, researcher in the Jerusalem Institute for Policy Research, who did research about vertical informality, the case of Kfar Aqab in East Jerusalem. Maliha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chava. Can you see my screen?
Yes, just move for a full screen.
I am trying. Just give me a second. Do you see the full screen now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. So hello, everybody. Thank you for attending the event. I am Maliha Zegaya. I am a researcher at the Jerusalem Institute for Policy Research, a part of the urban planning team. For my master's thesis research, I explored a case of vertical informal housing in a neighborhood called Kfar Aqab in East Jerusalem. And today I will be sharing this research with you. So let me, just a moment, it's not moving. Okay. So let me start with this image showing how the neighborhood of Kfar Aqab used to look like prior to 2007. And here I'm pointing to the year 2007 as a turning point, and I will explain later why is it a turning point. But for now, look at the image, and it tells a lot about how this neighborhood used to look like. It used to be a green, quiet village on the outskirts of Jerusalem, populated with only 8,000 residents who are living in low-rise housing built formally by the individuals on their own lands. However, this is how Kfar Aqab looks today. The neighborhood went through an explosive growth and a dramatic densification to populate nowadays about 80,000 residents who are living in high-rise buildings that are up to 16 floors. These buildings are built with developers for investment in an informal way. They are informally in terms of violating the planning codes, the building codes, and by building on land that is not registered formally. You can also imagine that the infrastructure is also going through a crisis. It is overloaded. It was formally designed to serve about 10,000 residents. Today, it is serving tenfold this number. So, and these images of the skyline of Kfar Aqab before and after 2007 pretty much explain the dramatic densification and clustering that took place in the neighborhood. And this is, as you can see, the neighborhood from the inside. This is a zoom in. This is how these buildings look today. So the first question that I asked myself is whether this, what's happening in Kfar Aqab is unique to East Jerusalem, or is it happening anywhere else around the world? For that, I started to look for similar case studies, and I looked for a set of criteria. I searched for case studies of informal housing with heights above 7 floors that is built that is not self-built, but is built by developers for profit and is profit-oriented for investments. And I found 4 case studies in Kenya, Bangladesh, Syria, and Egypt that pretty much share common properties. And based on that, I developed a definition of what is it vertical informality. But before going to the definition, I want you to stop for a moment here and look at this picture from Egypt. This is vertical informality in Egypt. And this image helps me explain why is it important to talk about vertical informality, why is it different from horizontal informality, and why do we need to address it. So now for the definition, and based on the case studies that I found and what is happening in Kufr Aqab, I see that vertical informality is developer-built mid or high-rise housing for sale or for rent that lacks formal registration, bank financing, and it may not comply with formal planning and building codes. So we see 3 components that shape this definition. It's the verticality, it's the informality, and it's the market-oriented development. Now that I introduced the definition, the next question that I asked myself is, what are the conditions of formation of vertical informality, and are those conditions consistent across different countries or not? This table actually shows that there might be some unique conditions that cause vertical informality here and there in the case studies that I found, but it also shows that in all the case studies in literature, there were 2 main conditions that that mainly led to the emergence of vertical informality. It is, first of all, the high demand for low-cost housing combined with the limited enforcement of regulations. Whether this limited enforcement is due to poor governance because the government cannot enforce the law, or due to that they simply turn a blind eye to it for several reasons. So now let's try to understand what's going on in Kufr Aqab and whether it's similar to these case studies or not. And to understand that, I need to talk a little bit about politics here, and I need you to focus with me because it is really complicated in East Jerusalem. So East Jerusalem is under the Israeli control since 1967. This event is called annexation by the Israelis, and the Palestinians call it occupation. What's important for us here is to understand that since 1967, the residents of East Jerusalem are considered legally as permanent residents of Israel and not citizens. This means that they all the time need to prove that their center of life, which means living and working, is inside the boundaries of Israel in order to maintain and protect their status as permanent residents. So this is one more point that we need to keep in mind. Another force that affected the situation in Kufr Aqab is the construction of the separation wall in the early 2000s between the Israeli territories and between the Palestinian territories of the West Bank. And although Kufr Aqab was and is still up till now administratively affiliating with the Jerusalem municipality, the Israeli municipality, and by Israelis it is considered part of the Israeli territory, it was physically separated by the separation wall from the rest of the city, and it was left on the West Bank side of the wall. This physical separation was accompanied with a dramatic drop or absence of law enforcement, including enforcing planning regulations and planning codes. Developers took advantage of that and they started building those buildings that we saw in the pictures. And the thing that caused that created the demand among the Palestinians of East Jerusalem is the fact that more than 60% of the residents of East Jerusalem are living under the poverty line, and at the same time they need to seek low-cost and affordable housing within the boundaries of Israel, again to maintain their status as permanent residents. So Kufar Aqab and the developer-oriented and development in Kufar Aqab gave an answer for what they are seeking. And this is what caused the emergence of this phenomena in Kufar Aqab. In other words, and if I want to translate this complexity in more academic words, it is again the very same conditions that the political and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict created are pretty much similar to those in other places where vertical informality is happening and is emerging. It is again the high demand for low-cost housing and the limited enforcement of regulations. Okay. So after understanding the conditions of formation, I asked myself, what kind of apartment buildings do developers construct when they are not bound by planning codes, building permissions, and mortgages? And here I have to say that I did a really in-depth analysis for what's going on. Unfortunately, due to time limitation, I won't expand on this, but I still need to say that it is risky. This development is risky both for the developers and both for the dwellers. Both parties have developed their own mechanisms to cope with the high risks of living under such conditions, but we still don't know what will happen next. We still have no guarantees. We don't know if the developer will go bankrupt before finishing the construction of the building and run away after getting paid by the purchasers. We don't know if the purchaser will stop paying after occupying the apartment. And again, there is no law enforcement in this area, so they cannot go to the authorities to manage these situations. We don't know what will happen in the case of what's the worst scenario that could happen in the case of an earthquake. If a building got on fire, as there are no compliance with the fire safety codes, with construction safety codes, or anything. Actually, one thing I really do know from my research is that there are those developers who do better than others. And those are, I call them higher or high-performing developers, and those are mostly the educated ones, those who have a sense of social commitment and a strong financial banking. And people, they managed to build a kind of trust between them and between the community. People already know who are the high-performing developers. Some of them don't and fall in the trap of going with the bad developers and are at higher risk of losing their investment and even losing their lives in case of disasters. Okay, and the last question I want to address here is whether this situation, this phenomena is a problem or a solution. Can vertical informality be part of a solution for affordable housing, especially in rapid urbanizing areas that lack the capacity for formal planning and housing? As we see in Kufar Aqab, we see that the positivity here is that this phenomena is supplying much of the needed demand, much of the needed and relatively affordable housing for Palestinians who are looking to protect their Jerusalem-based address, their Israel permanent residency. And as we see in this map, the price of an apartment in Kufar Aqab to the north is quarter the price of any other formally built apartment in East Jerusalem. And this is the positivity here, but at the same time, we know that this is a chaotic, vertical, and unrestricted development that leads to the consequent deterioration of the area socially, physically, and spatially. And these images show the negativities that I'm talking about here. So to answer this question, yes, we know that vertical informality is problematic in terms of the quality of the housing, in terms of the safety of the residents, the social problems that come with it, and the financial instability for all the people that are included in these scenarios. But at the same time, it is providing a quick supply of affordable housing. And I would say here from a Palestinian perspective, Palestinians who see themselves under occupation and that are dealing with an unjust planning system see this more of a solution rather than a problem. The benefits of alleviating housing distress for them outweighs the substandard quality and high risk. And I want here to make it to a general level and talk about vertical informality as a solution international wise. As we see, it's about 30% of the world population now are living under conditions of informal housing. And more slums and informal settlements are now expanding vertically. So could we consider this as a solution? I think that the answer might be yes, but it needs some intervention in order to make this kind of development safe and livable for the people who are excluded from the regulated planning system and are seeking homes in informal settlements. And with interventions here, I need you to think out loud for me. And I think that for me, this platform, the aim of this platform is to think together of what kind of interventions should we suggest in order to maintain the affordability and the fast supply and provide the living conditions and the safety of the residents of such areas. So perhaps we might consider some kind of training for construction workers and developers who are involved in informal verticality or vertical informality to produce higher quality buildings. Maybe we can think about supporting local developers and purchasers with semi-formal financial support. And maybe we can also think about protecting the purchasers by providing information about the financial viability of individual developers. And most applicable, we can improve the living conditions by providing and improving basic infrastructure in these areas. And I also think that it would be really life-changing if we think about consider training the community itself to create community-based initiatives that were proved by literature in several informal areas that it can be a solution for waste disposal, for traffic organizing, and for enhancing the drainage system in these areas, and so enhancing the quality of life for the residents. So for here, this is the case of Kufar Aqab. Thank you for listening, and that's it.
Thank you, Melicha. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Thank you. Please stay for our discussion later, of course.
Of course.
Okay, so we would like to invite Professor Alan Smart, who is patiently burned with us till now. It's morning, here it's evening, you know, to talk shortly about his experience about Hong Kong. And if we can ask you to respond or share your thought with us about what you heard from the speakers by now.
Okay, 1 second. Let me pull this up. Okay, so good afternoon, good morning from my side, and okay, there we go. So let me just first start with some comments and appreciation for the, first of all, for this wonderful and I think really important initiative that the Institute is undertaking. This has been a really informative and exciting set of papers for me to listen to. And I think that the whole focus on vertical informality is something that is really has a lot of potential. Just this morning, I was looking at Google Scholar for the term vertical informality, and you see very, very little, and some of it is, I think, doctors, I've seen a couple that seem to be connected to the Jerusalem Institute, and not much elsewhere, and a lot of the stuff isn't really, it's got vertical and informality in the paper, but it's not really about vertical informality. And I think it really has a lot of potential for facilitating the bringing together of studies like the Gecekondu in Turkey, the urban villages in China that really tend to not to be thought of in the same kinds of analyses. So just since I mentioned urban villages, they seem very similar to what Dr. Zugiar was just presenting about, but also to some of the things that Dr. Kapoor was talking about, and because when we think, and the name is very deceptive, because if you think about urban villages, you probably think about horizontal informality. But characteristically, they're kind of similar, about 8 to 10 stories high, and the kind of the property rights thing is really that that it's built on land that's not approved for building, but usually by local governments, actually. So it kind of has a lot of similarities to both of the Bombay and Jerusalem cases and so on. So there's a lot of potential for doing work on this. Let me just go through a little bit more systematically the three papers and kind of comments and questions. So Dr. Alterman, I think I've known some of her work on this issue, and I think this focus on non-compliance is really something that's a really good way of approaching, because when you talk about housing informality, the assumption tends to be that we're talking about low-income people. And I think the non-compliance idea is something that really has the potential for opening up our perspectives and our eyes and our views onto the informalities and illegalities in housing and property of the rich and middle class, as well as the poor. So it's kind of, I always prefer kind of agnostic comments that allow us to really start with a kind of a basic definition and then pursue it in all of the directions that it deserves attention to. And I think non-compliance as a focus is really something that does that. And Dr. Alterman is really, and in her collaborations with Dr. Kalor, have really shown the legs, the potential of that kind of approach. And I really think it's a good thing. And also it helps to come up, overcome some of the issues that Dr. Alterman was talking about today in terms of the ambiguities and overlap between informal and illegal, because non-compliance kind of basically covers both of them. So some of the non-compliances are simply a matter of informality. Many of them are a matter of illegality. So again, it brings together things that when separated, we perhaps get a less sense of the nature of the phenomenon. In the paper that Thomas Aguilera and I did in the same book that Drs. Alterman and Kalor, I think, wrote their first important piece on non-compliance, we focus on the issue of toleration. And I think that's something that it hasn't really come up in this one, but I think it's kind of an unspoken process. So when we're talking about non-compliance, normally, sometimes it's simply a matter of the inability or incapacity to deal or to enforce effectively, but often it has to do with forms of toleration. Like, why do you tolerate housing that in Mumbai doesn't meet, built by the government for resettlement colonies that doesn't meet the demands of the legislation. It's because it's useful for the government and it's useful for them to turn a blind eye to what's going on. And again, in Jerusalem, there's a huge demand for housing, that much even more so the case in Gaza and so on. And the only way of dealing with those constraints of space and demand for low housing is to go up. And again, toleration is somewhat kind of inevitable if you're not going to be able to willing to put up with the consequences of making a lot of people homeless or paying for housing that meets all of the standards. So comes down a lot of ways to questions you. Should we just tolerate it and let things go along as they are? Or do we change the rules? Or so there's a lot of questions around what is to be done, and all three of the papers, I think, deal really effectively with some of the questions and some possible answers. So Dr. Kapoor's paper on Mumbai is really, I think, fascinating. Again, I found a lot in it of value for my own interests. Partly because the history of housing in Hong Kong and planning and housing shares the same origins in British colonialism. And in fact, a lot of the planning interventions that came up in Hong Kong were actually borrowed from Mumbai and Calcutta. For example, the Bombay Improvement Trust was something that was transferred first to Singapore and then to Hong Kong. And even those early high-rise, or eight-story, I think you said, Dr. Kapoor, resettlement colonies, have very strong similarities to early public housing in Hong Kong in the 1950s. And the site plan of the NB compound is very much like the first generations of Hong Kong public housing, with corridors only on the outside, huge problems of ventilation, and as a result, also considerable problems with tuberculosis and other respiratory diseases. So that, one early study in Hong Kong is kind of, I think, is interesting to compare to the Mumbai study, is that it was a systematic comparison of morbidity and mortality in squatter areas, which were essentially horizontal informality, with private tenements, which may have been privately developed, but broke all kinds of building regulations about the amount of space, ventilation, and so on, and found that morbidity rates were fairly comparable, but that in the squatter villages, you had a much higher rate of infectious diseases that would be obtained from infected water supplies and so on, whereas in the private tenements, you had much higher rates of respiratory diseases. So I think quite similar there. And one of the things that happened in Hong Kong was that you had a lot of illegal extensions, and particularly a lot of the buildings had a kind of a central air well. So the idea that you would have some cross ventilation in the flats, which had been subdivided. And then you can imagine this, if you had, this is already this is a Kowloon walled city, but if you kind of extended this apartment over that way and enclosed this whole area, the amount of ventilation would drop very dramatically. Okay, so all of those, I think, are really things that I've learned, presentations I've learned a lot from, and will definitely be thinking about as I move forward. So without going on too long, because I'm sure there's lots of discussion to go on, let me just give you a few examples of vertical informality in colonial Hong Kong, because most of this is historical, and my research was ethnographic in the 80s and 90s. Hong Kong became part of China in 1997. It doesn't mean that housing informality doesn't exist and vertical informality doesn't exist in contemporary Hong Kong, but there's less work being done on it. And particularly, there are still about 200,000 squatters in Hong Kong, but very little research being done on them, and mostly in the rural parts or semi-rural parts of Hong Kong. But there's also a lot of, and one of the biggest issues at present in relation to this is illegal subdivision of privately developed and technically legal apartments. And some of those cubicle spaces are very, very tiny, as little as 4 square meters. Sometimes even including a little bathroom stall in that 4 square meters. And it's often the only kind of housing that people can afford. We don't know much about the health consequences of that, but it can't be very good. And the reason for this is that Hong Kong has the most expensive housing in the world. It used to be tied per square meter with London, but it's now moved well ahead of London. Okay, so my examples. So this is probably the most notorious example of vertical informality. The Kowloon walled city, which was finally demolished in 1993 after the agreement to return Hong Kong to Chinese sovereignty. So this is an example of the exceptions that create conditions for vertical informality. So that when in 1898, a deal was made with China to lease land for 99 years. That area, the new territories, had a compound that was the administrative headquarters. So in the treaty, Beijing left that as an exception, that wouldn't be part of the handover or the leased territories. And Britain basically neglected that. And they kind of welched on their agreement, but they never actually really took over control of that space. So gradually it became more and more vertical. And so if you look at this picture, this is basically one of the most kind of dense developments of informality anywhere, although I think some of the Mumbai examples look quite comparable. But and it really wasn't developers. It was a kind of a gradual addition. So floors were being basically started as a conventional horizontal informal squatter settlement, and then it got redeveloped, putting floors on top, sometimes building an 8-story building, and none of this was legal. There was no legal infrastructure. So I remember walking through the area, particularly during a rain. It was rather intimidating because you would have drips coming down at the ground level through this web of illegal electrical wires and kind of leaking pipes and so on. That definitely did not seem like a safe place to be moving about. And just rather amazing development. There's actually quite a bit of study of the walled city. So if anyone wants to follow up that, I'd be happy to send some references and things like that. So the other one that continues to exist in small numbers, I think about 4,000 occupants right now, is what Hong Kong called rooftop squatters. And essentially this is on top of private legal buildings, although with lots of non-compliant uses like illegal extensions. And then people basically build structures on top of the top floor. And it's essentially like a fairly well-built level of a ground squatter village on top of a building. And illegal extensions, we've heard about this from Dr. Alterman, but you had at one point when they basically, it was kind of turned a blind eye to until the early 80s. And then they did a systematic survey of illegal extensions to private buildings and found that on the rehousing standards, if they were to demolish all of the illegal extensions, it would require the equivalent of housing for about 200,000 people. So this was a very pervasive extension. And generally, there's a kind of a process in Hong Kong, as in many other high density cities, that no one ever has enough space. So when you can get away with encroaching on things, you basically take it over. And the kind of this is like shopkeepers that put a bunch of their tables and wares out on the street, people that turn the alley outside of their house into a card table and recreational area, informal gardens, and all kinds of uses of basically encroaching on space that isn't yours whenever you can get away with it. This is the topic that I'm focusing on right now in my forthcoming book. So it's not vertical informality in the sense that it's being talked about here, but it's vertical in the sense that Hong Kong is a very mountainous place, so that flat land tended to, with the squatter resettlement program, those tended to be demolished because they were easily developable. And as Dr. Kapoor said, they would demolish a high density but low height squatter village, build 8-story and later on 12 or 20-story buildings on, it was estimated about a third of the land that was being demolished, and the rest of it was being used for other private or public purposes. So you basically took horizontal informality and turned it into high density public housing and high price private housing and other government uses. But there was a big problem in that dealing with squatters on dangerous slopes. And in the early 80s, a study was done of squatters, and they found that about 25% of squatters were living on slopes that had a very high risk of landslides. And Britain was putting some pressure on Hong Kong to deal with all of the squatters, not just the one that they could easily redevelop. So the whole system of squatter resettlement had been based on redevelopment. And so squatters increasingly became concentrated in dangerous, undevelopable contexts. So they had a big debate within government circles of what to deal with squatters on non-developable land, because they didn't gain any land for development out of this. So it was basically all cost and no benefit for the government scheme.
Professor Smart, can I ask you to wrap up? We promised people that they will
absolutely
have time for open discussion.
This is my last slide.
So can you wrap up and tell us some insights that, different examples from different parts of the world that have a different, policy and different legal system? What can we learn from this? We saw today 6 or 7 different countries with the same or almost the same problem. So can you finalize your remarks and then we'll open a discussion?
Okay, sure, very much. Okay, so I think one of the things that I think vertical informality raises is it really challenges the assumptions of squatter upgrading or informal housing upgrading, because in the conventional approach that the World Bank championed, it was really based on the assumption of horizontal informality. So that the idea was that you would basically upgrade existing settlements, but the argument was that it's really expensive to add infrastructure to existing informal villages. So the suggestion was that you develop what's called sites and services projects. And so you would put in the infrastructure and then let people self-build on top of them. So you would get the best of both worlds, that you would get the kind of partial, slow improvement of dwellings, but you already have the infrastructure, so you don't have the problems of bad water supply, sewage problems, and fire dangers, and all of those kinds of things. That kind of model is very problematic when we're talking about high-rise or medium-rise buildings. And I think the final recommendations that Dr. Zugiar was talking about is some of the things we need to think about. Are there ways to build on the dynamic, creative, partial and gradual improvements that squatters tend to do in a kind of a horizontal context? And how do you transfer that into a vertical context? Because it's a much bigger challenge providing safe infrastructure in that kind of vertical context. And I don't think I have any particular answers, but I think those are the questions that we really need to.
Thank you very much. It was
about.
very interesting. And the comparison to Guolong, I didn't think about it. I know the case of Guolong, but it's really important. So now we still have some time for an open discussion. We heard 4 wonderful talks. And we would open the floor. If anyone wants to talk, please feel free, and we'll see how we roll on. Rachel, if you want to talk, you are still in mute. So I saw your hand. Yes,
yeah, I would like to
make to raise your hand. So I'll try to.
Just one statement that that will open a whole new area. I don't know to what extent the organizers, apart from you, are aware that I do extensive amount of research on towers. You mentioned illegality and danger. You mentioned danger. They are extremely dangerous. And this is way beyond the fire. Towers within Israel proper are all relatively new. So they're highly regulated. We don't have 15, 16, 17 towers that predate 1980 and even predate 1990. And despite this fact, I have calls from the Fire Authority of Israel, a 2-hour Zoom talk. What shall we do about fire protection? The problems of safety are enormous. Your building is not built for, I assume, it's not built for a fire within the building. Fires spread, in terms of physics, they will spread all the way into the apartments. Plus the fire, the watering fire hoses are not likely to work, and it is not possible to get people out of the top floors. The Israeli fire equipment does not go all the way up anywhere. So the danger is extreme because I assume that they are even less secure than the Israeli ones, even though the Israeli ones are built according to full standards. There will not be a fire spreading inside, not very quickly, but the fire hoses are a low priority in any condominium. The expenses of running a condominium are 4 to 6 times more than people see on the day-to-day basis. So there's just no chance that they will last with any reasonable degree of safety or life quality. And you mentioned infections, Alan, and infections. And I really wonder how they survived the COVID crisis if they were there already. Thank you.
Thank you. Emily Silverman, you wanted to comment? I see a hand up in Emily's, yes?
Yep. Just working
yeah.
with my other
Okay.
thing. So thank you to the Jerusalem Institute for organizing that wonderful discussion. I think it's really important. As I listen to this, I hear three different phases of issues. And one is the question that Rachel Alterman addressed with recognition of existing informality. And do you want to call it illegal and recognize it? And what does that mean? And that's one issue. Then there's a second issue that Malicha described. And here I cannot help but give a plug to say, if you want to read more about Malicha's research, there's an article that came out of her MA thesis in land use policy from 2021. And that includes all of the insights that you got from working with developers, Malicha. So if the first thing is recognition or non-recognition, the illegal versus informal, I think the second one is reform. You have this informal verticality, and we saw that in Namrata's fabulous case study, as well as in Malicha's. What can you do to change what you've already got in order to reform it? And Alan, I think you brilliantly added a third phase with the reference back to sites and services. What if in the kinds of areas that Malicha pointed to as being ripe for development of vertical informality, one worked in advance with a site and services type of approach, but for vertical informality, working with developers, working with community mechanisms to try to encourage lower cost high-rise housing in this way. It's a gray zone, because what does it mean who's working with if it's informal? But I think it's something I hadn't thought about before, of the in advance. And I think that Malicha's slide of the conditions for formations of informality points to the types of places that might perhaps benefit from this. So that'd be really interesting to look at in a follow-up study. Thank you. Thank you so much for organizing this.
Thank you very much. Alan, you have a hand up. Do you want to answer or comment about what Emily said?
Yeah, actually, I was responding to Rachel's mention of fire. And one of the things that I'm aware of but don't know too much about is there's been a shift, I think in the US, but elsewhere, up to performance-based fire safety standards. Instead, the old way was to have rules about how many exits you had to have per amount of built space and so on. So it was very rigid, and the architects had to work in their designs around those fire code regulations. And now you can kind of do different things, and then as long as you can show that you can evacuate the building, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you can not fit the original types of fire standards. So there's a lot of potential for using high technology, information simulations and so on to kind of adapt that. And I would think kind of retrofitting in vertical informal buildings with those performance standards would probably be one way of dealing with it, instead of having to fit with the regulations.
Marta, do you want to reply? Your presentation was a little bit different. You were talking about the influence of putting in redeveloping those slums and putting in inadequate buildings. But do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, this aspect of fire, even in when the municipality relaxes regulations, they don't relax the regulation for the the fire brigade to come into these buildings, which is very interesting because, you know, tuberculosis is a slow disaster which is happening, but if there was a fire, like it looks really bad on the municipality side to have a big fire. Anyway, but I've been thinking about this idea about sites and services for vertical buildings and how are they different from just providing proper layouts for people to go ahead and develop in those areas. Like we're coming to all we're saying is that we are not going to be regulating how you do the build form, but we are going all the way to saying.
Namrata,
right?
I think the difference is the involvement of for-profit developers. It could also be not-for-profit community level developers. But the difference is when you're moving to vertical informality, you're moving from the individual constructing his or her own home because of the complexities of building high-rise.
Right. I mean, I understand the idea of the incrementality, but like for a lot of the examples that we were seeing, they looked like local community developers were already sort of developing, you know, like full high-rise towers. Those are not incremental. They look like they were like full-scale incremental towers. The only difference seems to be that they are local developers. And does that mean like capacity building for local developers could also be another thing that, you know, we can start thinking about in that manner, because it doesn't always have to be, you know, government-led to adhere to certain norms. Some norms could be things which are easily adoptable. You know, for example, what Alan was speaking about in terms of providing fire safety measures, which are not necessarily elaborate, but you know, can be easily retrofitted into buildings. And just thinking about those aspects. I'll come back later.
Thank you. Thank you. I see Oren Iftachel. Hi, good evening. You raise your hand.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting and I think timely debate, because of course we're going to see it more and more. And as the UN Habitat tells us all the time, despite all the efforts, the number of informalities are growing all the time, reaching more than 2 billion people now. And also in Israel-Palestine, it's growing all the time. And I've worked a lot with Bedouin and Palestinian communities and I can see Yara here too that has worked. So it's very important to address it. I have one aspect that I want to raise, and it hasn't been risen yet. It's less technical, it's more planning, community, and governance. How are these areas in your cases being governed? And, you know, we have different accounts of course, the places are what I call gray space, you know, they're still under some kind of sovereignty of the states, but yet they have their own government sometimes, their own rules. Who decides about the rights of the people? Who decide who can go in and out? What happens in terms of conflicts, in terms of land sales? There's a whole government system. Dorit Garfunkel actually did a very good work in Israel about the towers that have their own little governments and how it influences urban life. And I think this is one big difference between horizontal and vertical informality, where in horizontal, there's obviously each family or household or person has some kind of little sovereignty over their plot. Small as it is, could be 10 square meters. But in vertical development, this kind of power is concentrated usually with developers or landowners or trespassers. So I'd like to hear from you, how do you define, or how do you see the government of these places, which is very, very critical for urban citizenship and rights?
Malicha, you want to respond?
Yes, thank you, Oren Iftachel. Okay, I'll start with this, that I can describe Kufar Aqab as a no man's land. And I would say that the Israeli authorities are turning a blind eye to what is going on there. They are not enforcing the law unless something what happens, and how do I put that? Unless the activities or the development that is taking place there is putting in danger another areas or another aspects of East Jerusalem and of the control of the Israelis over other places. There, I actually explored this in my thesis research, and I wish I had more time to talk about this more, but developers and dwellers have developed their own unique mechanisms to cope with the fact that this is a no man's land and there is no law enforcement. I would give one very exciting example that might make the picture clearer of how people deal with the day-to-day informality there. If a developer wants to purchase a land that is not formally registered, there is no formal papers showing the real owners of the land. And someone shows up saying that, claiming that he owns the land and he wants to sell it to the developer. One mechanism that the developers adapt is telling him that, okay, we will not pay you the price of the land. We will give you instead like part of the apartments in the tower, in the building that we are building. You will sell them and get the money. In this case, if the real owner shows up during the construction, they can deal with it, and those who try to do some fraud or claim the land ownership will sit back and say, okay, they will step out of this agreement. Another mechanism, for example, is that the developer would tell the one who's claiming the ownership, okay, give me 2 months. I'll start bulldozing the land, showing people around and the community that a construction is taking place in this land. And you know, this is a small community and everybody talks about everything that is happening around. And people will start talking to the real landowner, telling him, congratulations, you are making money, your land, there's development on their land. Then the real owners will show up and tell the developer, stop, this is our land. Who told you to start constructing there? And this is one of the mechanisms that saved a lot of developers from paying for unreal landowners and save their money and save a lot of problems. For residents, for example, there is no formal financing or mortgages. They would not pay the full price for the developer. They would pay a down payment and give him postponed checks, monthly payments. And if he stopped the construction for some reason, they would stop paying. This is also problematic for the developer because with the absence of the law enforcement, there are cases where the purchasers would stop paying even though they are occupying the apartment, and there is no way to, no legal way to bring them out. And these are the cases where violence is expected to take place in the neighborhood. It is not, as I said, there are coping mechanisms, but it is not ideal. We are still seeing a lot of challenges. People are still facing problems. And in this situation, I would say that the commitment of the community really affects the day-to-day living conditions. It means that developers would construct the building and they have nothing to do with the building once all the apartments are sold. And this means that each dwellers in each building need to collaborate with each other to make things go smoothly and to protect themselves with the absence of law enforcement. It seems that when people are cooperating together, things get better and they are more able to protect themselves. They are more able to agree on enhancing, for instance, the safety issues, the fire fighting issues inside the building. Also, although it won't be as safe as a formally built apartment building, but to a certain extent, those who manage to get along together and agree on how to make things better inside our apartment building will have a much safer place to live in than those who cannot agree to and cooperate together.
Thank you, Maliha. I'm sorry to say that our time is up and we need to finish. The discussion is not over, as we can see clearly, and we only start to dig deep into this subject. I want to deeply say thank you for the speakers and for all the audience here, and for the Nauman Foundation that supported us in creating this event. Thank you again for Rachel and Alan, Maliha, and Namarta, and thank you for the commentators. And we hope to continue our research in this informality and in vertical informality especially. Thank you very much and see you soon.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you for a
Thank you.
תודה רבה.
Bye.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Bye bye.
Thank you so
Bye,
much.
bye, everybody. Thanks a
תודה
lot.
רחל. Bye.
Bye.